Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. I won't introduce myself again. You just probably all heard that. Joe mentioned that I've been around for a long time, which is sadly true. But one of the places I started was with thinking about information back in the STC days, and working with Ginny Reddish, who's, if you don't know her book, Letting Go of the Words, Don't Buy Mine, Buy Hers, start there. It's just an amazing, amazing book about writing. And Ginny is who introduced me to plain language, so all of my content talks are really dedicated to her. But one of the people that really made the bridge for me between plain language and accessibility was a man named Clayton Lewis, who is famous in my mind for having written the peanut butter quote. He had an early book on user-centered design where he talked about how usability can't be something like peanut butter smeared over the surface of the application. And he gave a talk. I had the honor of serving on the committee, the Federal Advisory Committee that is updating we make recommendations to update the 508 regulations. And he gave a talk to us about cognitive disabilities, in which he said cognitive disabilities are very hard to write guidelines for because they're so diverse and so different. But they're also so easily designed for because they are the disability where everything you do to make stuff more usable makes it more accessible. Right. And that was pretty exciting. The other thing that was really exciting for me was learning about the World Health Organization's it is a giant compendium called the International Classification of Functioning. And it's a big, scary document. But in the last half of the 20th century, they changed the definition of disability. Definition of disability used to be what's called a medical model, which is it was a definition of impairment. And they changed it to what's now known as the social model, which says that a disability is the interaction between a person with an impairment and the environment or attitudes they face. And this all of a sudden is what got me excited about accessibility in general, because if disability is your physical condition, I can't do much about it. But if disability is the interaction between you and your environment and the things you have to interact with, then that's what we do, right? That's our job, is to make things that people interact with. And now we can begin to think about how every little teeny tiny decision, those 10,000 decisions a day that you make when you're designing something, how all of those add up to a more or less accessible environment for people, an environment in which people can function more or less well. And just to kind of layer this on a little bit, there are many more people with disabilities than you think. Even using the conservative estimates of governmental bodies that do things like use the American Population Survey, the Community Population Survey, to ask people about disability, we're looking at somewhere between 17 and 20% of the population with some form of impairment in their ability to interact with the world. Often it's mobility. And it's often age-related, right? You can see this curve goes up really steeply when you hit a certain age. Your eye, you just start to fall apart. It's all true. And even the standards organizations have gotten into the act because for a long time we really didn't have a definition of accessibility. But the International Organization on Standardization, or ISO, has been refactoring their 9241 series. The problem with standards is they have names like 9241. But there's good stuff underneath there. And they brought in process, devices, cognitive interaction, and accessibility into one series, acknowledging that they're all part of the same problem. And they defined the classic definition for usability, which maybe you've all heard, I hope so, is that it is the ability of the people for whom a product is intended to use it efficiently, effectively, and with satisfaction. And accessibility is therefore usability for more people, for the people with the widest range of capabilities. So we think about diversity of devices, we can now think about diversity of people and their choice of interaction. But today, we're focusing on content. It's the stuff in the middle of the page that people came to the site for, right? That stuff. Right? And one of the interesting things when we think about content is that there are a lot of different reasons why it's important, I think, as with so much in accessibility. One is that people read with different levels of literacy. They might be They might not read the language well, even though they're perfectly intelligent. They may not read carefully. Some examples of how that can produce some unintended results. They might have a visual disability that affects reading. It turns out that a lot of reading disabilities are actually visual. So things that good typographers know about space between the lines and the length of the line actually all affect people's ability to read, because if your eyes don't track a line well and get back to the beginning easily, then it's hard to keep your place in the text, and therefore it gets hard to read, just physically hard. I did a usability test long ago in the early days of the web where we had recruited suburban women who were 45 to 65 years old who said they used the web but found it hard to use. And they were looking at health information. And they kept talking about how uncomfortable they felt on the web. And I was reviewing the tapes one day, and I realized that the angle of the camera showed me something, which is that they were all sitting like this. They were uncomfortable. Not enough to complain about it, but uncomfortable. And about the same time, I started driving my poor sainted husband insane, because he's my IT guy, and I was bitching and whining and moaning about the computer and how it wasn't working and I couldn't click right and all this stuff was going on. And about this time, and he was just patting me on the head and there during me, and rightly so, I might add. And I went to the eye doctor for my biannual checkup, because I've worn glasses since I was 8, and he said, "Whitney, I got some news for you. You need bifocals." And I got my bifocals, and I came home, and I realized that I couldn't see the screen. I was misclicking because I was having parallax effects, right? I am a trained UI designer. I think about this stuff all the time, and I didn't realize what was happening to me. So this is about the stuff, a lot of what we do in content is about the stuff that we don't think about, because you don't think about, do I understand these words and is the information structured well, until it isn't, right? So this is about making sure that it isn't. But I also want to stop for a moment on this question of literacy. Now, the National Assessment of Adult Literacy is one of these big decennial U.S. government projects. And this is from, I forget what, but not 2010. And they divide reading ability into 4 categories. There's below basic. This is people who can read, but who basically can sound out words and read the words individually, but may or may not be able to string them together into a meaningful sentence, or can read only the most simple instructions or simple labels. So they're looking at nouns and verbs and not much else. Basic are people who can manage everyday tasks. And they go to the grocery store, they can get on the bus, they can read headlines in the newspaper. I mean, they're not illiterate, right? None of these people are actually illiterate. But they don't go much before that. The big section in the middle is intermediate. So these are people who can look things up, who can read material. And at the end, we have people who can interpret text and compare viewpoints. Now, which category do you fit into? Anybody that doesn't say proficient, right? This entire room. In fact, everybody in our profession probably is in that little 13% at the far end of the tail. And then there's this big 43, 44% who are almost half of the people in the United States. These are people who don't think about absorbing information through little funny shapes on a screen or page as their primary way of absorbing information. And yet, this thing, right, these are very text heavy. Even labels and menus and so on. So when you think about designing when we were designing only for engineers and scientists and ourselves, maybe we didn't have to worry so much about anything below intermediate. But the minute you're doing a general purpose tool, the minute you're writing for the general public and you want millions and millions of people in your audience, you really have to start thinking about this. So this is the sort of stuff that shows up in your tech support and in your abandonment and in how accurately people do whatever you've asked them to do, and so on. When we think about plain language, there's some myths that hold us back, and I'd just like to spend a little bit of time debunking them before we go into sort of what we ought to do. The first is the my audience is special myth. Right, my audience is somehow different, and it's okay that I have little tiny text because my audience is kids and they have good eyesight, and so I don't have to worry about it. Back to the Open University. Their typical student is a mid-career person going back to university. But with the change in the funding in the UK, they were now beginning to go after high school graduates. Right? So they have their typical sort of middle thing, but they're also older adults are part of their world. This, by the way, is written out in more detail in an article on UX Matters, if you want to go look it up there. But they're looking at teenagers for the first time. They've got older adults who are leisure learners, or I have time to study for myself now learners, and they have a strong immigrant student population. So people who may read well in one language but not particularly well in English. And it is an English university. And the question that was posed to Carolyn and I was, do we need different sites for these audiences? Right? And they said, and you have a couple of weeks to do it and not much budget. So we did desk research, or at least we started there. We spent a long time on the web, courtesy of an academic library. And we went back to professional research, to practical research. And we actually ended up pulling 3 bodies of work. The first was the Nielsen Norman Group on designing for teenagers, one of the first people to publish some of that work. They've updated it since. We looked at work that Ginny Reddish and Dana Chisnell did with AARP on older adults on the web, and we looked at the work that Catherine Summers and her brother had done on low literacy, especially on dealing with things like pharmaceutical type information. And we chose these, not only were they backed by a large body of empirical evidence, but they all had guidelines. Right? So they had big sets of guidelines that we could compare. And we did this thing where we sort of lined the guidelines up and we started shoving them around until we could find things that lined up. And we realized that, for instance, the guidelines for Nielsen Norman on teens were to write simply because teenagers rush through and don't read carefully. And Ginny Reddish's suggestion was to write simply for older adults because they will read every word on the screen. And the Summers recommendation for people with low literacy was to write simply because when someone who's having trouble reading gets tangled up in the middle of a sentence, do you know what they do? They skip to the next paragraph. Ooh, I saw eyebrows go up in front, right? You get lost in the sentence, you just jump until you can sort of reorient yourself. Now, what if the important information is in the last sentence of that complicated paragraph, right? It's invisible, right? And we kept finding these. So, use common language, be concise and get to the point. There's a whole bunch for visual. It turns out that teenagers don't like teeny tiny text either because you have to stop and pay attention to it, right? It's harder. And older adults don't like tiny text because they can't see it. And people with low reading proficiency don't like tiny text because it looks hard, right? So we kept finding something we called more alike than you think, right? That the reasons for the guidelines were different, but the result of the guideline was quite the same. Caroline actually went on to do a project she calls Design to Read, and there's a site for it online at designtoread.org, com or org, I'm not sure which, in which she lined up a whole bunch of researchers at the British version of Chi who were working with different audiences on designing for reading ability. And they were all very focused on their very narrow research audience. And again, she lined up all of their recommendations and discovered that, lo and behold, this effect kind of persisted, which is that we were hearing the same advice, sometimes framed slightly different, for very different reasons. And that made us start to think, okay, we're not research psychologists, we're not going to be able to prove that this is a deep truth about humans, but it was enough for us to start thinking that this is a good enough truth for us to use practically in websites today. So the second myth, so that's the first myth. The second myth is that technical information is supposed to be hard. God intended this to be difficult. It's hard stuff, and it should be. We had a guy on the standards committee for voting system guidelines who insisted that technical guidelines were meant to be technical, and that was just that. But they don't have to be. Right? NCI has what they call the cancer treatment guidelines. These are peer-reviewed by top oncology researchers. You can imagine the committees that produce them. They're updated annually or biannually, and they read like a journal, right? Lots of lists or semicolons and things like that, in big, dense paragraphs of text with footnotes. And the person in charge of it was listening to the work we were doing on the general site for plain language, and she wanted to try to apply this to these treatment guidelines. So she was taking tiny little baby steps. Like if it said there have been 5 clinical trials on this topic and it showed, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, instead of semicolons, she wanted to do bullets. And she was worried that doctors and other medical professionals would look at this and that they would discount the data because it didn't look professional enough. And I'll talk a little more about that effect later in this presentation. But so we were doing this with, and part of why she was doing it was that we discovered an audience, which was that we discovered through a bunch of research was that it wasn't top oncologists who were reading the treatment guidelines. They were looking at a whole different set of much more specialized literature. The people who were reading this were 2 big groups of people. One were advanced patients, right? Patients who wanted to know more. They wanted to know what their doctors knew. And general practitioners who are the bridge. GPs say, we take care of the person. The oncologist takes care of the tumor. Right? And the surgeon, so to your GP, you're a person, to your oncologist, you're a cancer, and to your surgeon, you're a tumor, right? And we look at the person, and we're the ones who get, when they have, a side effect, they don't call their oncologist, they call us, and we want to know. And there's some run-of-the-mill cancers that we know a lot about, but sometimes we need to know more to be able to help our patients well. So these weren't oncologists, they were people who were trained medical professionals but learning it, and they were very worried that they wouldn't think it was authoritative enough, because being the authoritative source of information is what NCI is all about. Right? NCI is the major funder of cancer research in the United States. They are the authority. And we had one guy in, and he gets to that page, and we're all like trying not to hint and not look, and all that stuff, and he went, "Oh my God, NCI's invented the bullet." And we stopped and we talked, and he said, look, all that stuff, how they say we have 15 minutes a patient, it's true. Our lives are really, really crowded and when I'm reading this stuff, I'm reading it fast. I need to be able to skim and scan, right? So again, we have a more likely thing. You might need the bullets because you have trouble reading the dense text, or you might have the bullets because you just need to read it really, really fast. And we started having doctors tell us that they often went to the patient information first, because it was usually easier to read, and if they got enough information there, they would stop, or they would then go on and delve a little deeper if they needed it. So the hunger for good, easy to read, well-designed information, because information design is part of plain language, it goes up and down the scale. There's no reason why, just because we can read it when it's hard, that we have to read it when it's hard, and it can be just as good. And the third myth is that people can't really tell the difference. Well, we saw in the NCI thing that they did, but Ginny and Dana did another bit of research. It was actually a pretty impressive piece of research for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We were planning to write plain language guidelines for voting system instructions. And it's not good enough in that environment to think that it's going to work. We had to actually know that it was going to work. And so they took we have a reference ballot that's a standard ballot you can use that's medium. We call it our medium complexity ballot that has 25 different ways people can make mistakes. And they designed a version of that ballot with a kind of traditional language looking at existing voting systems. And then they designed it written as well as they could, right, with all Ginny's great plain language instruction, and they tested them head-to-head with enough people to reach statistical significance in 3 different locations around the country, doing all the counterbalancing and the distraction activity in between and all the proper experimental methodologies. And they discovered 3 things from this. One is that people did, in fact, do better. They were telling them how to vote, right? Telling them how to mark the ballot, right? So we could tell whether they had accurately fulfilled the intention they'd been given, and that they were in fact more accurate on the plain language ballot. More importantly, they were more accurate on the second ballot, whichever one, if the plain language was first, that difference went up, right? So if the complicated ballot was first, they did better on the plain language ballot. But if the plain language ballot came first, they did better on the traditional ballot as well. And the difference was exaggerated. And then at the end, they asked them which one they preferred. And that's the result, right? Plain language version, 82%. Traditional version, 9%, and no preference, 9%. So they could tell the difference, they preferred it, and they performed better. So we had efficient, effective, and satisfying. So people can tell, they can tell when you've written for them and not written for your lawyers. So, when I talk to accessibility audiences, they often think content, but this is just text, no big deal. Text isn't a problem, it's just a screen reader will handle it, no problem, just make sure the text will be bigger. But there are actually, in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, there actually is mention of content, some direct and some others. The WCAG is divided into 4 big principles. They spell POUR, P-O-U-R, for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And understandable is pretty clearly about content. Guideline 2.4, which is in the operable section, says that we need to provide ways to help people navigate that content as well. Because when you navigate, you are, reading. Button labels, instructions, menus, prompts, titles, headlines. So all of those things you click on, especially if they're an icon with a label or a text link, they're content too. And then when we get into readable, the entire section about being readable and understandable. And there's a lot of detail about some technical things about marking, language changes, and so on. But basically, it's there. So let's think about a bunch of principles. When we wrote this book, we started out trying to think about principles of universal design, and our original idea was we were going to map our stuff into one of the existing schemes, and in the end we came up with our own scheme because we really wanted to think about how UX people think about designing something entirely and think about the layers we think about and then map the accessibility guidelines into that rather than the other way around. So we actually have one of our principles is that people can read, understand, and use the information. That's not we have a separate section for finding, which is navigation and wayfinding, but this all fits into Ginny Reddish's definition of plain language, which is that plain language is information that people can find, understand, and use. So it's not just being able to read it, it's being able to take action based on what you've read. And we have a bunch of principles, which I'm not going to stop and read out. We'll look at some of them. These are all online. We've put a lot of the material in the book open online. The personas are there, the principles are there at the detail. And for those of you who are actually dealing with 508 compliance, we crosswalk it to, we actually use WCAG, but we crosswalk it to the web guidelines. So you can take our principles and then you can figure out which guideline it helps you meet. So you can do that back and forth between the design process and the compliance process. But I just want to talk about 5 things today because it's, there's only so much time. I want to talk about writing for your audience, which I hope I don't have to convince anybody in this room, how to organize information logically, designing for reading, providing alternatives, and writing for action. Because I think that they're really, for me, the core of how I think about the content stuff in the screen. Writing for your audience is pretty obviously, in part, about speaking to them in their own words. I love this picture. It's actually from a voting context of a woman looking at the screen. I don't know what's on the screen. The picture just is out there. But I like to think that it's one of the many ballot questions in Florida this year that were at 1,500 words. And yeah, 1,500 words. If it's a citizen-proposed, constitutional amendment or ballot question, they're limited to something like 75 or 150 words. But if the legislature proposes it, it's all off. They can do anything they want. And you can write a thing where you have to vote yes to mean no, and you can do all of that. And I bet there were a lot of people who looked like that, who were sort of staring in puzzlement at the screen. Now, Steve Krug taught us all that don't make me think is the right answer, and Ginny taught us to let go of the words and not get so involved in them. But this is the face you don't want, so when you're thinking about audience. One of the places where it's pretty obvious which audience we're writing for is when we look at terms of service, right? Because your lawyers wrote those things. And there's a whole body of people who do legal plain language and who insist that it does not have to be unreadable just because it's legal. And so you see things like people writing gloss. This is from 500 Pixels, the photo site. And they've got the thing their lawyers wrote. And then on the other side of the screen, next to it, they have their plain language interpretation. Now, I'm sure it's not legally binding, but, isn't it nice? Here's what we do. Sometimes things will go wrong. Let's try to start with that plain language. One year at one of the plain language conferences, we were challenged to they put teams of people together a designer, a lawyer, a writer, and a usability person. And we were challenged to pick something, transform it into plain language, and then defend our choices at a kind of competition thing. And we chose the World of Warcraft terms of service. We actually found World of Warcraft players. We got them to read them. We got them to talk to us about them. It wasn't a lot of users. We did about six people, because what I know about World of Warcraft would fit into a very, very small thimble. And it turned out that the terms of service weren't that bad. They actually understood why all that was there, but it was this big jumble. Like they'd written these paragraphs and they'd thrown them in the pot and shook them up and put them on the screen. And there were things in the terms of service that were things you needed to know, for instance, as you were picking your screen name. Right? There are all these rules about what you can and can't name your character. You know, no foul language, no leet speak, no this, no that. But that was buried in the terms of service as a link off of it. Right? So it wasn't that it was written so badly, it's that it was all in the wrong place and organized badly. And so most of what we did was simply untangle it and think about before you start what you need to know afterwards and what happens if something goes wrong and we sue you. And I don't know if you're a World of Warcraft or a game player, but one of the big controversies in World of Warcraft was that they were dumping people out of the game. I mean, that the thing they do if they think you're breaking the terms of service is they simply cut off your access, and all of your gold that you've piled up in your character and whatever else you've got disappears. And there were international lawsuits over this. So these were people who actually did think about terms of service, which made it an interesting one to look at. But one of the processes of doing this is, even if you can't put that on the site, is being able to think about what it is you really mean, what it is you're actually trying to tell people, and make sure that somewhere in there you've got that information. Another thing you can do is think about summaries. One of the WCAG guidelines says that you should provide plain language summaries for pages. And that sounds icky, like, oh, there's going to be this box on the page somewhere that's in, dumbed down language. But NCI had an example of this. They have what they call the fact sheets. And at the top of the fact sheets, they'd been written over many years, and they had many different styles of them, which was a wonderful natural experiment for us to work with to figure out which ones were best. They had key points at the top of the page. And these are sort of FAQs. And the questions start with really simple things, and by the time you get to the bottom, there's a lot of long multisyllabic medical words in them. And when we tested them, this really interesting thing happened. Patients read them very carefully. Patients assumed that these were actually a summary, even though they were often just a restatement of the questions or even a repeat of the questions. They assumed that the thing in the box at the top of the page was the stuff they really, really, truly needed to know. So this is good. That means all we have to do is make sure what was in the box was what they really, really, truly needed to know. But an interesting thing happened when we worked with professionals. They skipped the box. They said, we assume that when there's box content at the top, it's the basic simple stuff for patients. And if we're looking for a medical answer, we can jump down. But if we're looking for language to talk to our patients with, we can go back up to there and pull that language. So this notion of the professionals using the plain language to model their own behavior, right? We're providing languages. And going back to Maria, one of our Maria participants said, these are great pictures. Can I use them? Well, they can. This is the federal government. Right? It's all copyright free. And it's in there, but all that stuff is in there in something labeled something like press room toolkit or something like that. Right? Nothing said, hey, do you work with patients? We have some great visuals you can use. Right? We never met them. That stuff was there. Might as well not have been. You might think about whether you need one version or two to do this. There's a scheme in the UK called Easy Read, which I had my doubts about for a long time until I realized that Easy Read is really the PowerPoint version. Right? Easy Read is meant, it was started in the social services departments, and it was meant to make sure that, in this case it was often printed material, was written in a way that benefits recipients could understand what their rights were, right? What they were entitled to, how to get their benefits. Right? These are not likely people with PhDs. And certainly not people who love interacting with government. Right? Government is maybe helping you out a little bit, but not something you want to spend your life talking to. So how do we help them get that information? They're in the middle of a process, a consultation process around whether the UK needs a constitution. And so they had questions that they had posed, and I love that the questions got created in simplified language. And I thought, couldn't you intersperse these? Couldn't you have the simplified stuff? One of the things Easy Read does include pictures. It turns out that one of the easiest ways to signal that this is the most basic, most user-friendly information on the page is to stick a picture next to it. And it turned out in some research, it didn't really matter what the picture was, actually, that NCI does not have separate sites. They don't have a site for patients and one for doctors. So we were looking for ways to put invisible fences around information so that they didn't dive straight into the medical professional levels treatment summaries, but started with the beautifully written what you need to know about things. So we put the what you need to know about things with a picture of the cover, and next to the one that was and then we had the treatment guidelines for patients, kind of a nice type underneath it, and then the next thing next to it was the treatment guide for professionals, next to which we put a really ugly looking acronym that medical professionals would actually recognize. And when we showed this in a big picture and said, where would you click first, people went, I want basics, and they clicked there, and the professional said, oh, that must be the hard one. That's the one I want. So we used not just the words we'd used around them, but how we'd place them on the screen to signal which level of information there was. And we asked sort of mid-level patients, and they said, oh, you don't need the professional stuff at the beginning of the session. And by the end of the session, they were saying, you know, it's actually good that it's there. So when I need it, I know where to find it. Right? So I can walk up that ladder of complexity when I'm ready to. Another thing about words is to think about leaping and landing on the same word. It's Carolyn made up the phrase, but this is a very old LaserJet 4 thing. If you had a button that was labeled printer control, you landed on a page that was called printer control. And if you clicked on a page called remote control panel, you landed on a page called remote control panel. This matters so much. This matters so much to so many people. If you are reading the screen through a screen reader, you want to hear from the page title, not just the title visible on the page, but the title in the title tag, that you've gotten to the right place. Did you actually get where you thought you were going? All of Jared Spool's work, where he would interrupt people as they were clicking and say, where do you think you're going? And then ask them if they got there when did they land where they expected to land. A lot of that is around words, right? It's around the choice of thing. And you notice in this we had color, we had words, and we had icons. So we were using 3 cues that you were in the right place. If you linked into another site, we showed the icon and the color. And this was is old enough, that the first screen of this taught people how to use color text as a link, because it was pre-web. Right? And one of the goals for this project was to decrease technical support calls, not to increase technical support calls. And the whole team, we all got assigned to a different channel. Mine was CompuServe. And when the thing released, we were supposed to be monitoring that channel, ready to leap in and answer questions. And we were like the Maytag repairmen. We were very, very bored. But they had done rounds and rounds of usability testing. We'd worked hard on this stuff. We had discarded a lot of really cute ideas we were all very attached to. It was also internationalized. It was released same day in 17 languages. So we thought about content expansion. I mean, we'd put a lot of work into thinking about how to make this as easy as they hoped the printer was. And the last thing in this is to actually talk to the audience. You can use the word you. Right? You do not have to use passive voice in order to get around having to name someone. And here's the interesting thing. You can use the word you even if the reader is not the you you're talking to. It happens a lot in medical information that the person reading the information is not the patient. It's the friend, family, caregiver of the patient. But you is still the patient in this case, unless it's a page about taking care of yourself as a caregiver, in which case you is the caregiver. There's a page in the IRS site that Ginny tested that's actually for people who are signing on behalf of someone else. Now, it's really clear in this case that that the person reading it can't possibly be the person who's going to be signed on behalf of. Sorry, that wasn't really a sentence, but that's how it came out. And yet, talking about that person as you, right? If you have someone signing for you, ask them to. Worked just fine, tested quite well, because the relationships remain clear, because the whole rest of the site is about receiving these benefits, right? So you can do it. early on in the days of IVRs, interactive voice systems, there was a lot of research that suggested that people did not like computers speaking about themselves in the first person. That especially if you were a not particularly technically adept older adult, you really didn't like this. And I'm afraid I have lost the reference. Someone told me this in a presentation, and I've never tracked down the reference, and I'm really sorry. If anybody comes up with this paper, I want it. But they actually tested a traditionally, you have clicked, I have, the button has been clicked versus you click the button, or I heard you click the button, or I heard you ask for language. And indeed, the satisfaction ratings were about what you'd expect. There were people who didn't like being talked to in first person by a computer. But the effectiveness of everybody went up. Even the people who didn't like it were actually more accurate. And there's a really simple reason for this in English, which is that when you talk in first person, you're talking in active voice. And so you've got somebody does something to achieve results. You're back to that nice agile sentence, right? And you're not doing this complicated, convoluted get around saying you. It's like the people who do who just can't get around the plural they, right? If you, they, right? It's fine. It solves, it reduces the words, it makes the sentence more direct, it makes it active, and it's very clear about who's doing what. And legal and language people are beginning to come around to the singular they, us, a person, they, as a way to do it. So think about talking directly to your audience. It creates a conversation. It makes that, we all talk about building relationships with our customers. Well, here's a relationship that you can build just subtly in the language you use. Second one, organizing information logically. More pictures from voting. More last pictures from voting in my life. That whole complicated thing about getting through a polling place and knowing where to go first and last and second. Same thing happens with content, right? The way we write the content and the way we arrange it on the screen helps us orient and navigate not just between pages, but within a page. So, again, back to an OU. This was for new to the OU. This is people who were brand new to higher education. This was teaching them the language. These were people who said, I'm not an undergraduate, when we asked them to find a course and they didn't click on the undergraduate catalog. I haven't attended university yet. How can I be an undergraduate? Right? So some really big, basic conceptual misunderstandings about how higher education worked. This was a little microsite that was designed to get them through that process and teach them the 4 or 5 unique things about the OU so that when they went to the main site, they weren't lost. We structured it all as questions. So the first thing you got on the page was a question. And the questions came from all the research we'd done. They were the questions people asked. Right? We asked them what their first 5 questions were about attending university. We echoed them right back to them. And they said, wow, it's like you know what I was thinking, right? What we did. The first paragraph under it answered that question as briefly as we could, with no it depends on, and no if your hair is blue and you live in the Shetland Islands and you're under 25 and your mother's name is Mary. None of that. All those complicated things gone. Just the simplest possible answer. And we got those answers by sitting with course choice advisors, like the people you'd go meet with if you were thinking about attending the university, and listening to how they explained it, because they were great at it. Then we had headings that made statements. Those were the PowerPoint points, right? If you only read the headings of the page, you'd have the basic information. Paragraph under it answered the question in a little more detail, 3 or 4 bullet points that really called out what you needed to know, and links maybe if there was more detail you needed or how to actually take action on this. And it was only about 13 pages. But they were structured to guide people through a process without having to say, now we're going to sit down and have a learning experience where we evaluate the OU, investigate the OU. Because I know they were coming into a higher education environment, but nobody actually really wants to do those things. Right? They want to read it in their own way. We just made sure that we'd presented it so that as they stumbled around the site, they were getting the information they need. And we were rewarded by students who we would then take into the main catalog, and they actually made good choices. As opposed to some of the really bad choices we've seen. My favorite one of these stories, and the story that actually convinced everybody, was we had a pair of people. One was a 50-ish Pakistani woman who said, my kids have grown up and it's now my time and I've always wanted to go to university and I'm going to go, but I know that I need to get my English writing and reading skills up to get ready. Now, it turns out the OU has an entire range of courses just for her. She is part of their mission. And she was sitting with her neighbor, a friend from Ghana who wanted to get a business degree. And they went through the catalog and they very carefully made choices. We got them to explain the choices they were making on each page. And they ended up at a senior level, nearly postgraduate course on English, on linguistics that was called English Language and Learning. Right? Because they didn't know how to read the levels. They didn't understand what levels meant. So we were guiding them to the wrong choices. And this site was designed to fix that problem. We were rewarded with people for the first time in the 2 years I've been working there actually saying, wow, open to change, that would be a great course for me to take, when it really, really was. Right? And actually going into these openings courses that were designed to do exactly what they needed to do. So, the other thing you can do is think about signaling in advance what the process looks like. It's not a game. It's not a mystery. When I renew my license in New Jersey, I get a page that actually still looks pretty much like this. And it says there are 4 steps. Here's what you're going to do. And by the way, get your credit card ready. You need your credit card, you need your vehicle ID card, and you need the thing we sent you in the mail with a magic number on it. Right? Because I don't really want to get halfway through here and discover that I can't finish because the car isn't here and the doo-wah's in the car. Right? I mean, right? Don't make it a mystery. Be clear about that stuff. Now I have a little tiny exercise for you guys to do before we do the next thing. In your minds or on a piece of paper you've got, draw a triangle on top of an upside down T. Everybody got that in their head? How many of you drew, ready? How many of you drew a pine tree? How many of you drew a wine glass? What did you draw? Okay, so there's kind of 2 ways you can, there are probably some more, but there are 2 basic categories of how you interpret these instructions, right? Because both of these match the instructions, an upside down T with a triangle on top of it. But if I say, we're going to draw a Christmas tree, put a triangle on top of an upside down T, then I've got the instructions in the right order. I've told you what you're going to achieve, and then I've given you the steps in the right order for how to achieve it. This shows up in very simple form in lots and lots of forms. How many forms have you seen that have a perfectly well-written label, a perfectly nice field, and then below it the warning that says what to do? Right? So the Government Data Services in the UK, which is doing some totally awesome and amazing work. If you don't know about it, you should look them up. GDS, they're in charge of UK.gov. They are reinventing government websites there, working with all the agencies. Carolyn was working with the farm agency called DEFRA on things like how farmers manage their communicating with the government about what they've planted in what field. So this also means that they are working with people who are not exactly in love with computers. And so they have been struggling with this whole question of date of birth, which turns out to be one of the hardest things to get people to fill in accurately. And they have a whole discussion about sliders and whether it's drop-downs and all of this, and they're actually on the verge of banning drop-downs because the number of people who can't use them is really high. And when the drop-down has to include all the years in which somebody alive today might be born, it's a pretty hideous list to navigate. And they came up with this one on the right. What is your date of birth? A type-in field with some stuff, examples, and then for example. And Carolyn said you could switch this by just putting the example above it so it's in the right order. If you're reading it linearly, as you are, and then you should do one more thing, which is the MMDDYYYY should be not inside the field, because the minute you start typing, what happens to it? It goes away, and often doesn't come back. Right? So even as good as they've gotten it, you can still go further in helping people do it. But the most important thing is getting the example above the field. Yes, ma'am?
I'm curious about the example above the field because a legitimate argument can be made that people can skip it if it's underneath if they feel oriented enough. So
they can skip it when it's over if they feel oriented enough too.
Pardon me?
They can skip it on top if they feel oriented enough. It works just like the doctors or the medical professionals who skipped the little prompt. But you know, which order is this, right? I've very carefully used a date that's unambiguous, but dates are actually quite interesting because depending on where you come from, 12, 11, 12 could be 2 different months, right? So getting that stuff right matters. And people who read fast will skim it fast and see it. Now, it's not a paragraph, right? It's just a little bit of a hint. But now think of someone who's doing this with a screen reader, right? Or has linearized the screen, or it's on a tiny screen and it's dropped below the field, right? Getting people primed to do the right thing. I saw another hand go up. Yeah.
I was just going to say, but this goes into the argument of systems thinking versus human thinking and making users have to enter something in a system-based syntax.
Right.
If you put it in,
Yes.
If they put in 12/28/1970 versus 28/12, the system should be able to.
Right. Yeah, and so Carolyn actually has gone a step further and suggested something. I don't know if you know Carolyn Jarrett. She wrote a book called Forms That Work. She's also working on a book on surveys, which you should all write to her and tell her to finish it already, because I want it out there. I want the stuff. She's spent more time than most of us watching people fill out forms, and she said, yeah, why not just have a big empty field that says fill in your date and then echo it back to them with words, right? Because if I echoed it back and I said, wrong thing, don't have it on here, and it said, your date of birth is 21st December 1954, then because I've restated it in an unambiguous way, then they're really clear that the computer heard them accurately. And if you want to avoid round trips and mistakes, and the problem is that if they get if they really said, oh, it was October instead of November, that mistake won't be clear until well after they finish filing this form for whatever they're filing it for, right? But it's like you talk to someone and they ask you to read it back to make sure you've heard it. Well, why can't the system just read it back for us? And then you can just take it in any old way and not force people into little boxes. So I really hope they take the next step. But so there's one other thing that you can do is think about hidden instructions. So this is now going one step beyond just cognitively understanding the form, but thinking about how what the World Wide Web Consortium unfortunately calls user agents, by which they mean browsers and assistive technology. But it's one of these standards geeks things where you try to find a neutral word and you end up with a word none of us understand. Right? So if you're using a screen reader to read this form, how does the screen reader know what label is associated with what field and what prompt is associated with what field? And there's a coding way to do this. Now, had anybody who designed forms been part of the original HTML group, we wouldn't have this problem, because forms designers know that a field on a form is a label plus a prompt plus a set of validation rules plus a place to enter it, right? And that there would have been a sort of object that put that all together for us, and you would have put instead of just putting a thing on the screen and then slapping a label somewhere and hoping that it's visually associated. But there's a way of attaching it by doing label for, right? So this is a very simplified version of the code, but so one extra step actually makes it read-write in code as well as reading-write visually, right? And that's the kind of stuff that accessibility lives and dies on. I was working with a company that sells sports shirts, things like that, and their site, okay, it was pretty bad, but the basic form to actually order for was okay, except you couldn't pick the size. So in fact, if you were using a screen reader, you could never buy something from them because you couldn't ever fill in that form. I mean, it wasn't just a missing label. It was actually a fully inaccessible widget. And you would always get a message saying, please pick a size. Right? So you could never actually buy anything if you're using assistive technology. Oops. Right? I asked them what they're doing. They said, well, off screen it's a drop-down. I said, what are you going to drop down on screen? Put it somewhere where we can find it. I mean, so they're losing customers. And it's not just annoying people. They're actually losing or breaking the law. They're actually annoying people. So, moving on to, we're getting late on time. Design for reading. There are 3 big things here: headings, color, and basic information design. F-pattern reading, familiar to you guys? Right? People read down the screen. They sort of hit the big headlines or beginnings of paragraphs. And you get, this is a 2-column layout, so you're getting a double F-pattern in here. But when you look at eye tracking examples, you can actually see the difference between scanning and reading, because this is scanning and that's reading. Sorry, it's small because but NCI has some very, very long pages. And they have very long pages because they want all the information to be on one page so people don't lose it. So, for instance, there might be someone looking to see which form of treatment they'd like for prostate cancer, and there's 5 forms, and they're going down the page. And this was the top of that page. And they go hoppity, 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 hop down the page, looking at the headlines and the headings, and then they got to the section that they wanted to read, and they switched into reading. And when I printed it out, it was like 5 sheets of paper. And the person in charge of writing that thing at the bottom had that in her cubie, because she's like, look, they actually find it, they read it. Because everybody told her read below the fold, nobody will ever read it. But because they had good headings, because you could skip, and if they had a little on this page link, it'd be even faster and wouldn't have had to have all that scanning. They could have just jumped to it, but whole other story. So doing that. So thinking about headings as landmarks within the content, and then thinking about making sure that they are really headings. That is, they're marked up with a bracket H, or H1 to H6, in appropriate order so they can be navigated. Because if the text is just large and blue, then the meaning is entirely assigned by visual presentation. If it's marked as a heading, then all sorts of good things happen. Browsers know it's a heading. Screen readers can jump from heading to heading. Search engines know it's a heading. It becomes an anchor link for an anchor for an anchor link, and all sorts of good stuff can happen. And you can begin to take your visual hierarchy and translate it into a coding hierarchy as well. I'm always shocked when I see sites that don't do this, even when they've got headings, even when they've got decent headings written into the content, but it's not coded right. And you sort of wonder why that could possibly be. And we want to think about how that information is designed. If you don't know about this project, it's a wonderful one. Deborah Adler, for her graduate thesis, redesigned the Target pharmaceutical labels. And Target has actually adopted them, right? So they've taken them further. So we go from sort of this hideous block of text to the drug facts format. But they go a step further. She said, what's the most important thing you need to know about a bottle of medicine? Well, let's start with, is this mine? Right? Because if you've got 2 people in the house who take medicine, so the little rings are actually colors that you can pick. And they'll put the right color on your bottle so you can tell your medicine from your husband's medicine or your kid's medicine. And the other thing that you really need to know is which one is this? Is this the amoxicillin, or is this the one? Is this the other one? And people actually do know the names of the meds they take, right? And if you flip it over, the other big thing at the top is Miss Target Guest, presumably your name, is right there on top of it. And on the back are all the warnings in a really clear, bulleted way. What do you need to know about this? When do you take it? And then in little tiny type is the doctor and when it can be filled. So there's a real information hierarchy here about what people actually need to know, and especially what they need to know when they pick it up and just kind of look at it quickly. If you use tables, you may have heard people say don't use tables. Well, that's not the full sentence. The full sentence is only use tables for tabular data. Right? Tables are not an excuse to do layout. But you can even think about how to design those tables. Tom Tullis at Fidelity did a bunch of work on comparing different table layouts with zebra striping, alternate row colors, with lines. And his conclusion from that work was that zebra striping works really well. Jessica Enders picked up this work. She's in Australia, picked up this work and carried on and did another series of experiments on how do you help people track across rows, and she concluded that zebra striping also works. So we've got different contexts, different cultures, and separated in time, which is kind of good stuff for experiments. So when you think about tables, think about tabular data. Have good headings, right? Because screen readers read headings just like we do, right? Just like you do visually. And you can mark the headings in the code. So under the covers, you can actually mark where those headings are. But you want to be able to say, I want to go to the column on X and find that and jump to it quickly. So all of the things that you want to do. She's also done some other things here where she's highlighted and called out meaningful data. So she's actually gone a kind of step further in thinking about how you turn this from a bunch of numbers and rows and columns to things that focus on the meaningful information. And don't use color alone to convey meaning, right? That's not don't use color. Color is good. So don't use color alone, and pick color wisely. So a stop sign, it's octagonal, it's red, and it has these kind of white squiggly shapes in it. Right? So that can all add up to that. And if you're thinking about a table of data, the first row, which has a green check and a red check, for yes and no, might be indistinguishably and meaningless to someone who's red-green colorblind or who's on a screen that doesn't communicate color. A green check and a red X, better. We've got shape and color. And we also might have position. And the words yes and no in green and red might take it a step further because now we've got cognitive content, color content, position. Most of the time I talk about, especially content, how it's just the stuff you're doing anyway done better. But there is a moment when we have to actually think about extra work. And that's when we start thinking about alternatives for many senses. And that's largely alt text. Alt stands for alternative text. And I had a moment, I was working with a newspaper, and they were all worried about alt text on their images. And I'm talking to their vice president in charge of design, and I said, look, alt text on images is a journalistic problem. It's not a technical problem. Right? You have photo editors. Those photo editors have chosen that picture and they put it in that article for a reason. Right? They've got a caption, but why did they choose that picture? What are they showing? That's what the alt text needs to describe. Right? So there's a great tutorial on alt text on a site called WebAIM, which if you're interested in accessibility, I highly recommend to you. It's a University of Utah project. The general guidance is to keep the alt text short, describe the image succinctly. I tend to write slightly longer alt text because I'm adding additional content. But focus on the keywords. It does not have to be complete sentences. It does not have to. Don't waste words on that stuff. Describe the aspects of the screen that are meaningful. Right? If you're describing the difference between a painting and a sketch, then you want to include the fact that one is one and one is the other. So what is it that the painting is showing on the page? And finally, one of the really ghastly things that content management systems do, evil, wicked, nasty things, is that they put things like file names into the alt text field. And so when you run your checker, they pass. And if you ever want to see this in action, look at ads, because the ads have names like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 0, 0, 0, 0, 7, 4, 3, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1. And some of my blind friends say, it's actually kind of cool because now we know it's an ad. Right? I can skip it over really easily. But actually, I'd like to know what this ad is, because as ads get more personalized, I might actually want that ad. I want to know what that is. And why shouldn't I have the right to know what that is, and not that it's 1, 0, 0, 0, 4, 7, 4, 3, 2, 5. Right. So alt text is contextual. So when we look at that picture, which happened to be on a U.S. wildlife site, I might just label it fox. Right? I might label it red fox if I'm talking about red foxes and I want to be clear that this is a picture of red fox. I might label it with where it was, picture of rare red fox photographed at a certain wildlife preserve. I might put some of that into the caption, or maybe it's on a photo site, and it's really a picture of red fox looking pensively over its shoulder. Right. So what you choose to put in it makes a difference for why it's there and what kind of site it's on. Now, there's a whole interplay between visible caption and alt text. So the more information you have in the visible caption, the less you need in the alt text. But even things, even things like you're doing a bio and you have, Whitney Quesenbery, and here's a photo, and then here's my bio. So you've got Whitney Quesenbery, a photo of me, and the sentence probably starts with Whitney is a. And the question is, do you need to put alt text on that image? And the answer might be yes, because maybe I'd like to identify which picture on that page happens to be Whitney, right? And so maybe it's just photo of Whitney, right? It doesn't have to be long and complicated, but something that identifies the image. People who are blind write PowerPoints. They put images on the screen. They might want to send it to somebody. All kinds of reasons why you'd want to do that. Yes?
So that partially answers my question. How valuable is it to include visual indicators such as the color red?
If it's meaningful. Right? So if this is a wildlife thing and we're talking about gray foxes and red foxes, then the fact that this is a red fox is meaningful. If it's just a four-legged mammal that's cute, then fox is probably enough. Because remember, someone has to listen to those words. A woman named Day Alexander has a wonderful site called forsyllables.com, and she has a little flow chart for thinking about alt text. Because one of the things you could do is decide not to show the image at all. So one of the options for the photo of Whitney is to do what we call null alt text, that is quote space quote. And when it sees null alt text, it knows that it's just a decorative image, and it doesn't even indicate the presence of that image. So it's essentially made it invisible to a screen reader. So if it's purely decorative, it's just a little dingbat on the screen, then maybe you null it or you put it into CSS. If it's sensory, you describe the sensation, right? If it's about, but in that picture, if you're using pictures as basically large bullets, they could probably be nulled. If you're using pictures to communicate meaning, then you want to talk about the meaning. If it prevents new information, you can null it out if it's totally repeated. So if it's an icon of a little envelope next to the word email, you might null it out because there's no new information. The icon is simply a visual eye catcher. No point in having to repeat it. But if it does present new information in some way, you want to describe it. And if it's short enough, you can just make it be an alt text. If it's a link, you have to have alt text. If you've linked it, you have to put something in there, or else what happens to the link? It disappears. Poof, link all gone, right? And if it's long, if there's words on the screen, if it's long, you can actually link to something. There's a big technical argument going on about long description. It's been in and out of HTML5, and the jury is still out. I often put in the alt text and in the caption a link to where a bigger description of the text is if I have a big infographic or something. So thinking about alt text, if there are words in the image and they are meaningful words, repeat them. Right? We do not need to know that there's a little green backgroundy thing or that there's a picture of an atom behind the words. That's not meaningful. What's meaningful is that there's a webcast and the data of the webcast, and we're going to link to it. If it's just little goobers on the screen, null it out. And think about how the alt text interferes. So here we have a picture of somebody getting an award, and that's the real caption. So the alt text actually just identifies the two people in the image with, unfortunately, a lot of abbreviations and stuff, but it is a government agency. Right, so you've got that going on. And now we know that this picture is of Birnbaum and Collins, and the caption describes the event. Right, so they work together. And if you've got charts and graphics, don't try to describe the data. Give us the data in text. This is from something called Career One Stop. It's a federal-state partnership that has information for state career centers. And this page used to say, education versus income, and have one big graph on it. And they said, how do we make this accessible? And we said, well, first of all, let's write a meaningful title. More education equals more money. Let's think about the most important data we're showing and give us a little paragraph of it. We use accessible colors for the bars. If any of you are looking puzzled about this and thinking they're not, they are. They are because we've mixed red and blue, not red and green. And if I render it in gray, the red is light enough that it renders as a middle gray, and the blue is dark enough that it renders as a very dark gray, almost black. So we worked really hard on those colors. The alt text here says something like a graph of the data below. And right below it, we have a lovely table with the data. Right? So we've told you what it's going to we've told you what we're talking about, we've told you what we're going to show you, we've showed it to you, and then we've given it to you in data form. Right? And so people who are visually oriented see the big picture. We didn't put the data above the image. See the image first. Pick up the data if you want it. You notice it's not all the underlying data, it's just the graph data. Right? And there we go. So are we over time at this point? Have I rattled on? No, we're okay. Good. This is still on East Coast time, and I'm lost. And I took slides out on this because I thought it would take us down a little bit of a rat hole for time. But the other thing is to think about media. So if you have audio, if you have video, if you have animations. Right, the whole trend towards we're going to explain how to use this thing by doing a screencast, where people keep saying, as you can see on the screen, right? Maybe you can't. So you need to think about alternatives for that. There's some real advantages, by the way. If you have a transcript for an audio file, you now have that information in text form, and it's now searchable. It's now SEOable. And if someone is in a position where they can't listen to it, for whatever reason, they don't have headsets with them, they're not in a place where they can play audio, they can whip through it quickly. There are some lovely systems that take your video of the person talking and the slides and the audio track as captions. And instead of doing captioned video, it's actually 3 windows, and you can click anywhere in the text and jump to that point in the video. And it's really lovely because now I can skim and scan through the text to find the section I want in an hour-long lecture, which I love in my OU coursework. So you might find that some of the stuff that starts out as a compliance solution actually ends up becoming a usability solution to help people interact with the information better. So moving on to active voice, writing in the positive and active verbs and positive messages. 2008, a whole bunch of things happened in November. One of them was that Al Franken was actually elected to the Senate, something we didn't actually know until June. We thought Bush Gore was a long siege, 3 levels of court suits, Minnesota, and Mark Ritchie. In most states, the Secretary of State is ultimately responsible for elections, and Mark Ritchie was elected to the position of Secretary of State in 2008. He was basically a farm rights guy, wanted to come work on farmers, and got elected in the middle of 2 major recounts, one of which went on for almost 6 months. He turned out to be a really good guy. He was very transparent about it. His staff got death threats. I mean, the whole thing went on. And it turned out that election hinged on not how people marked the ballot, but whether absentee voters had filled out the outside envelope in a way that enabled that ballot to be opened and counted. That's what that election hinged on, the instructions for completing the envelope for your absentee ballot. Now, something you may not know about election law is that often those instructions are written into law, not regulatory language, legal, statutory language. Michelle Marut is at this conference. We were working on a project in New York where they had gone from the big lever machines to paper ballots, and she was the one who caught that the instructions actually told you to fill in the oval next above the name, but it was actually below the name. And the only saving grace is that those instructions were on the back of the ballot in 6-point type. 4 years later, although the election departments have quietly gone ahead and changed those instructions, the legal language has not been changed because the New York State legislature is one of the most ineffective in the country, and there's a lot of gridlock there. And although a new ballot, the User-Friendly Ballot Act has made it through the Assembly twice, it has not made it through the Senate committee for reasons that have nothing to do with what's in the law, but a lot to do with all the other politics. It's very sad. Minnesota, however, is a happier story, so we'll tell that story. After that election, they all set to work revising the law because they were going to fix this problem. And the Brennan Center, which is a civil rights justice center in New York, called me up and asked me if I would review it for design. Now, the way you write a law is in what's called markup. So you get something that's got track changes on, right? Things marked in, things marked out. It's in legal language anyway, and it's just awful. It's just awful. And what I always do is sit down and draw it because I can't read this stuff without drawing it. And I'm always being asked about design things. I mean, that's what they would ask me about. And so I wrote back to them and I said, I will be happy to work with you, but I'm not working in markup. We're going to work in design. And to their credit, the Secretary of State's office said, well, okay, show us. And so I got a team together, fine language people around the country, and we started hacking at this thing. They started out about as ugly as you can imagine them. We had constraints like it had to fit on 1 sheet of paper. There are 4 variations. They include people who are military voters. They include instructions for people who are not registered yet. They let people change their registration if it's within the same district. There's just all this stuff going on. But we did a bunch of rounds with them. We did things like we had pictures. They had pictures too, but they just had 2 pictures that weren't connected to the text at all. So every step had a picture next to it, and there are all these verbs. Prepare your envelopes, fold it, place it, put it, sign it. Right? It was very verb-packed, so you walked through the actions. We put something at the top of the page that said, before you start, you need the following things, including, by the way, someone to witness you signing it. Weird things like that. And we did a whole round of this stuff. And then we got volunteers in Minnesota. I never actually met them. Never met these people. Got volunteers in Minnesota to run some usability testing. They did intercepts at a public library. having put together packets of this, came back, did another round of improvements after that, and then the Secretary of State's office called me up and she said, I don't know if this is the right way to do this. I mean, I want to do the process right, but shouldn't we test this stuff again now that we've made all these changes? And I said, what a great idea. And I called the volunteers, and they were busy and they couldn't do it. And she said, you know, we worked with them, and I think we could run this test ourselves. And they did. And they did another round of testing on their own. And it got through legal review. It got through into the new law. And this is a great success story, but it doesn't stop there. Here's the cool thing they did, because I just think it's awesome. Every year after the election, every year after the election, they analyze the absentee ballots that were spoiled and that couldn't be opened. And they look at what was wrong with them. And they try to fix the biggest problem. And so every year they have updated and improved the forms since then, continuing to whittle away at the number of people whose ballots can't be counted for purely administrative reasons. Right? Yes. The other thing to think about is writing things in a positive way. I'm going to pick on the English a little bit because this is partly about British turn of phrase. But what was going on at the Open University when they changed systems is that all of a sudden there were what was known as top-up fees. So a university could charge up to £3,000 a year on top of any government subsidy. Now, for all of us sitting here in the United States thinking, £3,000, that's about $4,500. That's what it costs to go to college for a year? Yeah, that's what it costs to go to college for a year in the UK. This was causing riots in the street. Right, because there had been no top-up fee at all. And all of a sudden, the Open University went from someplace that was expensive to someplace that was cheap. Right? And so they wanted to tell people about it. And so they wrote a sentence that said, a typical 3-year degree at £3,000 a year adds up to £9,000, a hefty sum that doesn't include living costs on average, blah, blah, blah. You know, and they have all these things, and they kept stressing this £3,000 a year. But what they were really trying to tell you was that the OU fees were £1,500 a year. And it was, as you can see, a little long. And we asked some very nice teenagers in sixth form to read this and tell us what the OU costs. And they said, well, it costs £3,000 a year, doesn't it? Right? Over and over again. Because they put the not before the, you know, they got the negative first. Instead of saying, the OU, on average, costs about $15,000 a year. Now, let's compare this to all these other universities where you have to pay up front, and you don't have to pay up front with us, and, you know, all the good things we can do. People were getting the absolute negative, wrong impression about the OU because of how they wrote the content, even though they had all the right stuff in there. Another example. Back to NCI, actually, one of the lovely things about working with government data is that lots of people can use it, and so you have built-in experimental data because you have different interpretations of it. And this is a little quiz to help people go through an assessment for their risk of getting colon cancer. And I've shown the good one. Ignore how it looks visually. It's done by Harvard researchers. But the NCI one is the one I want to tell you about. I know they've changed it, so I'm not going to put the screen up there and embarrass them. But people would get through these questions perfectly happily, nothing wrong with the quiz, nothing wrong with the assessment, and they would say, your score is 65. And we'd say, okay, so what this thing tell you? And they'd say, I got a 65. And I'd say, well, what does that mean? And they'd go, well, it's 65. And I'd say, what are you going to do? And they would say, I'll ask my doctor, because in any medical situation, I'll ask my doctor is always the right answer, right? And these were not uneducated people, but they had no idea what this score meant. And then we found this one from Harvard. That had the same questions, but this is their results screen. Now, it's not beautiful, but it's kind of zoned well. It starts with a clear statement. Compared to a typical woman your age, your risk of is much below average. Then they explain what below average means. Then they show it to me in a gap, and we've got my risk and my lowest possible risk. It's not 0 because you know, you've lived and there you are. And so there are things you can't undo. And they can show you the gap between it. So they have it visually. You know, we can see where we are. We can see we're in the bottom good part instead of the red bad part. You could click on these links and find out what answers put you in in the good or bad risk thing. And then they did this awesome thing. Watch your risk drop. Here are 3 things you can do Here are 3 actions you can take. And by the way, here are 3 things of your answers that are good things that helped improve your score. And we showed this to people and asked them to go through the quiz, and they said, I should be taking aspirin, and maybe I'll exercise a little more. I mean, all of a sudden they were actually talking about things they could do in a positive and realistic way. They understood what it was, and they also understood that someone who got this result doesn't need to ask their doctor. Right? They're doing fine. Someone up here. Oh, that's a different story. And they got a much different screen. Right? So thinking about what the purpose of this is. The purpose was not to warn people they're about to get colon cancer. The purpose was to change behavior. Right? This is all about health prevention, or bad health prevention. Right? And making sure that people understood what actions they could take to improve their health. Well, the number 65 might mean that to a bunch of researchers, but it sure didn't mean that to anybody we talked to. So thinking about what you're giving people and how they might take action for it. Oh, I had this in here. Here's the voting one. Right, that's the instructions, which all of 2 lawyers ever read. No one ever turned their ballot over to read those instructions. Those instructions were actually written not for a paper ballot, but for a lever machine. And so we suggested some better instructions for the ballot. So that whole thing got turned to this. Here's the kind of cool thing. We actually did a workshop with people in New York State with election officials, taught them some basic principles of plain language, gave them the instructions, and asked them to write their own plain language instructions. And they came up with something that is substantially like this. So substantially like it that we actually pulled some of their language to suggest for the legal rewrite, because it was better than ours. They knew elections better. So, and these were people who I think before I spent a day with them, I would have thought didn't care, or felt that they couldn't change the language. And we just said, look, let's put the lawyers out of the room for a day, and let's just think about what we can do. And often they do know the right thing once they're freed up and given some guidance to do it. So your lawyers might too. Your developers might too. You might too. Once you're able to sort of get past all of that. We've talked about this, which is the definition of plain language, and like many other fields, this has also gone from a technical definition. The early definitions of plain language were really around the way it was written, but this one is around users, right? That people can find, understand, and use it for their purposes. And Ginny Reddish wrote this definition. It has been adopted by the U.S. Plain Language Associations and the International Plain Language Associations. And so it's being instantiated in there's actually a Plain Language Act in the U.S. that says that as of October 2010, that any material written or substantially revised by a federal government agency must be written in plain language, appropriate for the audience. There is no enforcement to this except citizen complaint. But it also required that every agency have a plain language coordinator, which created a position of somebody who can run around and do it and work on this problem. And it has, in fact, had some effect, especially on the kind of agencies that spend an awful lot of money answering user questions or citizen questions. It was modeled in part on, there's a program here in Washington State called Plain Talk. It was a state-level program. And one of the famous stories from it is the $8 million letter, that's the amount of extra revenue they collected above their target from rewriting the information on a letter that went out, basically a dunning notice that went out for people who owed certain taxes. Right? So it doesn't just reduce tech support costs are really user complaints instantiated in time and money, but it actually produced better results. Right? It helped people know whether they needed to meet the law, be willing to meet the law, and actually do it. And it turned out when they did some testing that a lot of the non-compliance wasn't because people were being scofflaws, but because they literally did not know if they should. And if you don't know if you should, you don't. Right? And I think ultimately we can add this up to plain language is really accessibility, is really usability, is really user experience for information. And that's kind of cool because there's a whole body of work around it that's well researched. If you don't know Karen Shriver's work, she has a an older but still a valuable book called Dynamics of Document Design, and she continues to do a lot of research into plain language and trying to answer the question of, is the stuff we tell people to do, is that backed up by evidence? Does it actually produce the real results we hope? And I think the international efforts in government plain language are really paying off because it gives us a lot of empirical data from, if it works in Finland and it works in Spain and it works in the United States and it works in an Asian country, then there's probably something going on underneath it that we can count on. And so that's been nice because that international effort has really begun to produce some good evidence-based work that we can, hang our hat on. We have, I think, a few minutes for questions. I hope you have some. Yes?
My question relates to the use of snappy language or language that's designed to be more modern or not friendly but more hip, and how that works for an overall audience.
Well, I think one can always go overboard. But I do think that one of the things that people who try to make their stuff a little snappier, I think is a good word for it, do is it's often shorter, it's often more informal, and it's often much more conversational. You can think about whether you've gone too far, but stuff that says, hey, wait a minute, you forgot to tell us this, is much nicer than field 45 left unfilled. So I think there's a range, there's a too much range and a too little range, and you've got to figure out where you are. And I suspect that you want your bank to speak to you a little differently than you want your Facebook to speak to you. So you might think about the domain you're in. I don't really want my medical, Oh, okay. Here's a good bit of research for it. Again, NCI, cancer. Sorry, it's a depressing day. But there's all these sites that let you search. The NCI by statute maintains a database of clinical trials that patients can join. And lots of different sites have produced front ends to access it. And we tested 5 of them sort of competitively. One was clinicaltrials.gov, which is the geeky one. NCI was trying to be sort of friendly. There was one from a pharmaceutical-driven site that was trying to help pharma companies find patients. There was one from a patient advocacy site, and one that was aimed at people with low literacy. And so we had the same data being seen through these different filters. And then at the end, we let them pick. We did some randomization, blah, blah, blah. But at the end, we had one of those big sheets of adjective words, and we asked them to pick 3 adjectives that reflected how they felt about that site. And what was truly amazing was that they picked words that I think the sites would have been proud of. So the patient advocacy site got caring and friendly and helpful, and NCI got authoritative and professional. And the pharmaceutical site actually got not quite trustworthy because they wanted to know those things. And the low literacy site got easy. I mean, so they actually they knew their audience, they knew what their mission was, and they actually had reflected that in both how they designed and wrote the information. So I think if I was worried about that with my own work, I would test it by asking people to echo back what they were hearing and tell me, whether you're doing collaging about relationships or asking them to pick adjective words, but I would do some kind of research that got at the emotional reaction that was having and make sure it's the one you want. Rob.
Do you have any tools that you use for literacy level setting?
Literacy levels. I am a diehard Ginny person, and we don't like reading level testing. All a reading level score thing does is count syllables and numbers of words. So television will score very badly on that, even though everybody actually knows what a television is. And TV will score very badly because it's an acronym. But if used as a little tiny bit of a canary in the mine shaft, it's helpful. And there are, what is the name of this program? It will come to me as soon as I stop trying to think of it. But there is a tool that was meant for, the sort of policy teams that work in government where you've got people sitting at desks and their job is to write this stuff because they're experts in it, not because they're experts in writing or design. And it uses a whole battery of testing, and it doesn't correct it. It just flags the places in the text it thinks you might have written in a complicated way. So it's really a kind of reviewer over your shoulder saying, did you really mean this paragraph to be 700 words long? And did you notice that you used passive voice 14 times on this page? And by the way, there's this awful long words here. And so it's designed as a kind of bubble up the problems tool. I will remember it in a minute. But so I think that's where it's useful. I mean, it's easy to laugh at grammar checkers, which tell you things because they're not that sophisticated, and they're not written for writers. They're written by people who are trying to plug an algorithm in. And so I think the algorithms aren't that great, and how they're presented back to the author are even worse. But I think we're beginning to see some things around that. And I'm starting to see small little plain language things where they just take some of this and reverse it into checklists. Do we have good headings? What's the longest word we've used? How long are our paragraphs? Do we have lists buried in paragraphs instead of in lists? And some of those are perfectly easy heuristics for either for someone to whip through and look at things, and they're much more effective than looking at reading level. On the other hand, if you're writing for third graders and you've hit college level, you probably have a problem.
Well, and part of the work that we're doing is with Medicare and Medicaid folks, and so the company is taking their language and pushing it out, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So there is, if you're working in health, there is a huge and brilliant body of work on health literacy. There are several very good vocabularies, medical vocabularies to help you find the simpler word to match. University of Missouri is one of the funded projects on that, and there is just an amazing body of work on this, because medical literacy is a really interesting challenge, because you've got both the reading problem and the science problem all wrapped in together. So that's actually an area where there is some really great guidance. The CDC does wonderful work. It has some good guidance on it. If you're doing anything legal, the Archives, which runs the Federal Register, has a plain language program there. Oddly enough, the federal plain language guidelines are really quite good and were vetted by industry. If you're working in financial, the SEC plain language guidelines are beautiful and beautifully designed. The New York City Planning Code Handbook, building code, building zone code, not building codes for the building, but zoning guides, zoning plans. I don't know who did this work, but they redid it entirely. And each zoning type is a 2-page spread. It has a picture of the kind of neighborhood it is. It has offset shown visually. It's just amazing. You can if you search for New York City zoning guide, they have some sample pages online, and you can buy it for not very much money. And it's just a work of art. I mean, it's amazing. I showed it to some people, and they went, "Oh my God, we're working on an entrance to a building," and it's like all of a sudden they were like looking at it. If you want a great example, in Washington State, the core rules for labor and industry. Ginny worked on this for many, many years, and it's the stuff like ladders and gloves and tires and weights of trucks and all that kind of safety things for workers. Again, they had an effect where people were begging to read it because they finally understood it. So there's some great examples out there of how regulatory nasty stuff got turned into real things. And the cool thing about the labor and industries work is that they weren't writing gloss on the law. They were actually rewriting the regulations in plain language, which is even better, right? Because now the source is understandable. So there are resources out there. There's also a really great booklet if you're looking at cultural literacy that, again, it's written for the healthcare field, but it's on cultural communications with different ethnic groups in this country. That's just, again, a beautiful body of work.
The thing you cited was CORA rules?
Core.
Labor and industry, what was the word?
Oh, the core, C-O-R-E. They took a big shelf of books and they said, the beginning of each of these books has the same stuff in it, and they pulled those out into the core rules. Yes?
Curious, do you have any thoughts on just how to go at improving a large set of pages? You've got 1,000 pages and I want to do exactly what you do.
Right. Well, the first thing you want to do is figure out what your target is, and can you systematize it. The thing we did with the OU really was that process, was thinking about not just how we would write one page. So we wrote some pages and we tested them, and then we kind of pulled the pattern out from there. But thinking about it in terms of patterns, and then attacking it. I mean, you can't do headings by just doing every 150 words and whack a heading in, right? You've got to actually read the stuff. And I know that a lot of times these projects don't get started because they seem so big. You could think about doing it a page at a time. You could think about doing layers at a time. I've often thought that forget World Usability Day and World II Day. Let's have World Alt Text Day. What if all of us committed to going through our site and writing meaningful alt text, the degree to which this would improve the experience of the site, and then next year we could have World Label For Day, right? And we could just take some of this easy, low-hanging fruit that doesn't change the design and just pick at it. So maybe it's going through your picture library and getting decent alt text written. Maybe it's going through and putting headings in. Maybe NCI didn't change the size of its font for 6 years and still hasn't completely. Because we knew every test, they would go, Whitney, I know, don't tell us, we know it's not big enough. I know, you have 4 more people saying it's not big enough. We tested what size it ought to be, we knew what size, we knew all this stuff. And they said, oh, but we have so many style sheets, and it's so this, and it's so that, and it's so blah, blah, blah. If they had just started on it, and if they'd put 1 day a month into it for those 6 years, it would have been done, right? Make it your little displacement test. I mean, so, are you training up a bunch of writers, right? Are you teaching those writers? Ginny doesn't do plain language for people. She does workshops. She actually gets the owners of the pages to rewrite their own page. Because going through that for 1 page, and then she'll check your first 5 pages, and then you're on your own. And while you're writing that 1 page, why don't you do 1 more? Every time you post 1 new page, post another one. Every time you revise a page or check a page, if it comes up for, if you're a kind of site that has a review cycle. When it comes up for review, fix it. Right? And so, it'll be a little uneven and nasty. Or you could think about a pyramid. You could think about what pages does everybody see, and what's the information hierarchy. Maybe the pages down at the bottom stay a little nasty for a while, but those pages that lots of people see start to clean up. But I think we often just don't start that journey at all because it's going to be too big a project. Yes.
Have you noticed a generational gap in plain language as well? One of the things that I'm challenged with in my current project is I'm trying to write help content for a very technical application ID provisioning and whatnot. And one of the people who is mainly responsible for writing the content, I've been trying to do the style guide to guide her on what content to write. And she's writing things like, for whom are you making the request? And using very proper structured English. And when we've peer reviewed it, people are like, why didn't you just ask who are you making the request for? She's like, well, that's a heavy proposition. And it's like, I understand, but that's what people relate to. That
Mary Wise, who actually trained as a clown, was the president of STC for a while, and she had a lovely presentation about vowels we should give up on, and whom is one of them. There's actually a Princeton joke about like sentences. Young kid gets off the train at freshman day. He's straight out of the city. He's got other stuff, and he gets out and says to the guy after he sees him first, hey, where's the library at? The guy goes, young man, you're now at Princeton. We use proper English here. Maybe we should end a sentence in a preposition, and perhaps you could try that again and improve your language as the first step of your education. And the kid replies, camera still on, isn't it? Oh well. Okay, try again. Where's the language at, asshole?
Yeah, I understand. I understand that all of us got beat up by Miss Somebody in 8th grade about that stuff. But, and the problem is that person may in fact talk like that, so you can't even say right the way you talk. Right?
and just to put but there appears the older folks all agreed with the for whom versus the younger generation seem to be like, well, why?
Yeah. The battle I had at NCI was complete sentences. Being willing to write a caption or the gloss under a link in an incomplete sentence. And they finally went, okay, Whitney, we see the evidence, but please just help our hands do it. It goes against everything you've been taught. Yeah, no question. There's not a great answer for that. One answer is maybe they shouldn't be writing that help. The other answer is maybe they need to work with users a little bit. right, and see that. Maybe we need to find a way to get them into the field and see the reaction that language is having. Maybe we talk about word count. I mean, maybe we look at how complicated it is to translate. I mean, I don't know the situation you're in, and maybe you can't get rid of her, right? So you're kind of stuck there, right? Usually you are, and they're valuable employees, and they usually have huge amounts of knowledge in their head that you need. Maybe you could ask, bring in some 18-year-olds and ask her to explain to them how to use it, and do it as an informant. So we do it as an acting it out and recording it, and maybe she does explain things better when she's speaking. It's only when she's writing that this grammar rules come out, and get her to think about that in the conversational stuff, and then give her a copy of Ginny's book, because Ginny's old and has white hair, and she can do this. So I know we're now out of time, and now we have to